Hello, and welcome to the audiobook version of The Default Life by Sam McLoughlin, read by the author. We'll start with the introduction. First dates are fun, aren't they? If you've never been on a first date and would like to impress your potential mate, here are a few tips. First, for the guys, open doors for your date. Car doors, front doors, restaurant doors. Every door you happen to come across, make sure that you get there first. This will show that you're a gentleman. It will also impress her mother, who will probably text your date 7 times before dinner asking things like, "Is he wearing a tie?" and "Did he open the door for you?" Second, don't let her pay for anything, even the tip. This is a chance to show off your generosity, another attractive quality you may want to emphasize. Tip well, unless your waitress is much cuter than your date. In this case, tip slightly above the requisite, but only slightly. As well, try not to even look at the waitress, because your date is probably comparing herself to Jillian, your barely dressed waitress, and is feeling self-conscious. You know what? Avoid restaurants with cute waitresses named Jillian altogether. That's a good plan. Finally, for guys and girls, come prepared with interesting conversation topics for those inevitable awkward pauses. Don't interrogate your date. Instead, let the conversation flow naturally. If you happen to get stuck, you can use one of my tried and true conversation starters, like this one. So, what method of torture do you find most interesting? The torture question is good because it shows you're interested in history and other cultures, but not in a nerdy Ross Geller kind of way. It is a perfect first date question, in theory. The one time I actually used it, I was at Starbucks with this girl I'd been sitting next to in social justice class in my first year of college. It was raining, and she didn't seem very excited to be there. I'd been watching a TLC special on torture that day and couldn't resist bringing it up when small talk ran dry. She gave me a weird look, and then pulled out her cell phone and started texting. Instead of giving up, I decided to press on and tell her about the Chinese method of water torture, a last stab attempt to pique her interest and win her heart. You see, the Chinese knew the best kind of torture wasn't physical, but mental, so they'd tie you up and lie you flat underneath a dripping tap or something. When I first heard about this, I thought it was because after a while, the water would start boring a hole in your forehead. Can you imagine? But you probably wouldn't live long enough for this to kill you before disease or starvation. Instead, the random drips would cause the victim to lose their minds, as they could never predict when the next drop would come. More texting. There are actually lots of ways you can use water to torture people. Waterboarding, forced ingestion, and something like those dunk tanks you see at summer camps and school fundraisers, where you throw a baseball and your teacher gets all wet. My date put down her phone, looked out the window, and announced, "Isn't it interesting that when you think of the Chinese, you don't think of their art or history, but of something violent? Typical. I mean, when an Arab thinks of an American, or vice versa, they think of bombs and terrorism. When a German thinks about a Frenchman, or vice versa, they think of all their ancestors whose wives were raped and whose villages were plundered over centuries of war. When we think of ancient tribal cultures, we think of human sacrifice and slavery and war. Quick, picture an Native American. What is he holding in his hand?" "A tomahawk. They used them to scalp their fallen enemies," I begrudged. "Exactly. Now, without thinking about it, name the first German that comes to mind." "Hitler." My point exactly. You don't know how to see things from anyone else's perspective but your own. What about Germans like Wagner or Bach or Nietzsche? People who actually contributed something of value to civilization. Instead, you think of a fascist dictator who killed millions of Jews. Well, it is a pretty surefire way to make a name for yourself. Her frigid stare shot through me like an arrow through canvas. "And when men think of the Chinese," she continued, "they picture their interesting torture techniques." "And their food," I injected. This is what you get when men run the world. Another tip for first dates. If you met your date in a social justice class and she orders a tall, no-foam soy latte in her own cup, she's probably a feminist. Prepare yourself. "That's just the water in which we swim, I guess," I said, shifting the blame to the culture that raised me as I've been taught to do by television and liberal politics, while also steering the conversation towards something more familiar. Side note, my favorite author, Chuck Klosterman, a pop culture-obsessed Woody Allen lookalike, says in Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs that he has prepared exactly 3.5 dates worth of intellectually stimulating banter, all of which I deliver spontaneously, he explains. If I can just coerce women into the last half of that 4th date, it's anyone's ballgame. I've beaten the system. I've broken the code. I've slain the Minotaur. I've learned much from Chuck, and in my college years crafted a similar approach. However, I hadn't compiled enough material for one date, let alone 3.5, so I learned to plunder a few interesting ideas and stories from semi-obscure authors that my dates had never heard of, and present them as my own. The water in which we swim? I don't get it, she replied. Well, have you heard the one about the 2 fish? I asked. No, this isn't a joke, is it? Feminists don't like jokes. No, well, not really. So, now completely ripping off David Foster Wallace from a commencement address he gave at Kenyon College, there are these 2 young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" I am an incredible plagiarist. The tiniest little smirk escaped her lips before instantly disappearing. Okay, I get it. The water is the stuff around us which is causing us to think certain thoughts, live certain ways, etc., without us ever noticing what's really going on. Success. I'd managed to skillfully steer the discussion away from anti-chauvinist ego politics and into my home arena, philosophy. Exactly. These days, quoting Wallace again, the most obvious, important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. So it's these realities that are coaxing people like me to think in cultural stereotypes, like the Chinese being maniacal torture experts. But these realities are doing so much more. They are subconsciously coloring in our thoughts and moods. Can I ask you a personal question? Do you believe in God? Well, that's a bit much for a first date, don't you think? What's religion got to do with anything? Everything. Your belief in God is entirely dependent on your environment. For instance, if you lived 4,000 years ago, you'd believe that it was God who made the rain come and the crops grow and so on. There were so many problems in the world, so many roadblocks in the way of survival, that belief in God was a life or death matter. You had to sacrifice. You had to pray. That's also why they killed people for heresy. By speaking against God, you might be bringing trouble upon everyone else. But nowadays, what is our environment saying to us? We're sitting on couches at Starbucks drinking coffee made from Indonesian beans and porcelain mugs shipped in from China while people around us complain about how rainy it is and how much the Leafs suck. By which I mean the hockey team, not the foliage. Yeah, so? She replied. Well, we aren't at war with China or Vietnam or Germany. We aren't fighting desperately for survival. We've given ourselves over to a system that has provided wealth and success and comfort and peace. And we've got nothing left to do but go to Starbucks and complain about the weather. We're done. We don't have to worry about rain falling or crops growing or our general survival. We've got no more urgent problems, no need for solutions. We'll just let the system take care of our worries and just play golf. Or if it's raining, we'll go to Starbucks. But still, something's wrong. This culture is shaping us, coaxing us into a sort of default mode. The trademark lifestyle of unthinking America brand consumerism. You know, like working a 9-to-5 so you can buy sneakers and cologne and fill your apartment with cutesy IKEA furniture. Watching DVDs of Family Guy and Lost. Going to the mall, then to the bar. Basically living the kind of life that turns some of us into workaholics, some into alcoholics, and the rest into whiny, selfish hypochondriacs. The kind of people who get ticked off every time we get cut off in traffic because we were convinced by that Lexus ad that if we drove this car, the seas of rush hour traffic would willingly part in humble submission to our glorious egos, suitably couched in a wonder of modern engineering, plastic, and steel. We put the system in place. We gave it our blessing. And we don't realize what it's doing to us. We're unhappy. It's not because we don't have enough money or things. It's not because we haven't put a check mark next to everything on our to-do by age 25 bucket list. It's because there's no reason to change. There's no real reason to want to be more than what we already are, or believe in something or someone like God. We just run along in default mode, trying to ignore that constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing. Borrowing another man's ideas may be a no-no in term papers, but in conversations with virtual strangers who don't read commencement addresses by postmodern fiction authors, it works quite effectively. Some infinite thing, like the ability to have a conversation with a virtual stranger about the meaning of life, about God, without being interrupted by trivial things like text messages, Twitter updates, and the constant worry that you aren't dressed well enough. I get it, yeah, is what I wish she'd said. Instead, she replied, "Sorry, I lost you when you said bucket list. All I could think about was how I'd like to adopt a panda and teach it to love. What were you saying?" "Never mind," I replied. 2 words that seem to pin themselves to every important conversation I've ever had, and probably ever will. Conversations like this one have helped me to realize something profound. I am constantly being shaped by the world around me. Most of the time I suffer from a sort of tunnel vision, incapable of noticing what's going on around me at any given moment, of waking up to the fact that this is water. This is water. I don't notice how the water is changing me, making it harder to feel empathy, to live purposefully, and to think critically. How it interrupts my ability to hear my own voice, or God's. I wake up some days and notice I've been coaxed into unawareness, into an apathy that has descended upon me like a dark mood. If I want to live differently, the least I can do is start to notice how.